The wind carried dust across the valley in long, quiet sheets. Emmett Crowley stood at the fence line of his ranch, watching the horizon blur into nothing. His hands rested on the weathered wood, knuckles white from decades of holding reins, mending wire, burying things he wished he could forget. The horse appeared first as a shape in the heat shimmer. A bay mare, riderless, moving with the unsteady gait of something that had traveled too far without water. Her coat was matted with sweat and dirt, her mane tangled with burrs. But it was the way she walked, head low, eyes dull, that made Emmett push off the fence and start toward her. She didn't bolt when he approached. That alone told him something was wrong. "Easy now," he murmured, reaching for the trailing reins. The leather was cracked, brittle from sun and neglect. The mare's breathing was shallow, ribs pressing against her hide with each labored breath. Emmett ran his hand along her neck, feeling for injury. His fingers found the bridle first, old military issue, the kind that hadn't been standard in near 15 years. The brass fittings were tarnished, but still visible beneath the grime. And then he saw the tag. A small metal plate riveted to the cheek strap, stamped with faded lettering. He tilted it toward the light, squinting. "Property of Lt. Samuel Hart, 3 RD Cavalry." The name hit him like a fist to the chest. Emmett's hand froze on the bridle. His breath caught, held, then released in a slow, controlled exhale that did nothing to steady the sudden roar in his ears. Samuel Hart. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 8 years, hadn't allowed himself to think it in 6, but here it was, stamped in metal, staring back at him from a ghost that shouldn't exist. The mare shifted her weight, and Emmett forced himself to move. He led her toward the barn, his mind racing through calculations he didn't want to make. If this horse belonged to Samuel Hart, if she'd come from where he thought she had, then someone had sent her, or someone had survived. And Emmett Crowley knew, with the cold certainty of a man who'd spent 8 years trying to bury his guilt, that he didn't deserve to see who. He tied the mare to a post inside the barn, out of the sun, filled a bucket with water, let her drink slowly. Her eyes followed him as he moved, and there was something in that gaze, something almost human, that made his hands tremble as he reached for a brush. He was working tangles from her mane when he heard the sound. Footsteps. Small, uneven. Emmett turned slowly, brush still in hand, and saw her standing in the barn doorway. A child. Maybe 7 years old, maybe younger, hard to tell through the dirt and the hollowed-out look of someone who hadn't eaten enough or slept safely in too long. Her dress was torn at the hem, her feet bare and bleeding from walking. Her hair hung in matted clumps around a face that might have been pretty once, before whatever had happened to leave her looking like this. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Blue, bright, impossible blue, even through the exhaustion. Samuel Hart's eyes. The girl stared at the horse, then at Emmett. She swayed slightly, one hand braced against the doorframe to keep herself upright. "That horse knows me," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked from thirst. Emmett couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at this ghost made flesh, this impossible thing standing in his barn. The girl took a step forward, then another. Her legs buckled, and Emmett dropped the brush, lunging to catch her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her to the workbench, cleared a space, laid her down as gently as he could. Her breathing was shallow, her skin fever-hot. She didn't open her eyes, but her hand reached out blindly, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "That horse knows me," she whispered again, and then went limp. Emmett stood frozen, holding this child, this stranger, this echo of a man he'd failed, and felt the weight of 8 years settle onto his shoulders like stones. He looked at the mare, still drinking from the bucket, at the bridle tag glinting in the dim light, at the girl's face, so much like her father's it hurt to look at. And he understood, with terrible clarity, that the past he'd tried to bury had just walked into his barn and collapsed at his feet. He moved on instinct. Years of ranch work had taught him to act first, think later when something needed saving. He carried the girl into the house, laid her on the bed in the spare room, fetched water, a cloth, a blanket that didn't smell like dust and regret. She didn't wake when he cleaned the cuts on her feet or when he spooned water between her cracked lips. Didn't stir when he pulled the blanket up to her chin and stood there, hands shaking, staring down at her like she might disappear if he looked away. Outside, the sun dropped lower, painting the valley in shades of rust and shadow. Leave. Emmett returned to the barn, unsaddled the mare properly, checked her hooves, found nothing broken, fed her hay, a small measure of oats. The horse ate like she'd been starving, and maybe she had been. He picked up the bridle, turned it over in his hands. The leather was cracked beyond repair, but the tag, that damned tag, was still solid, still legible. Property of Lt. Samuel Hart. Emmett traced the letters with his thumb, and the memories came whether he wanted them or not. The war, the orders, the smoke rising from the farmhouse while he'd sat on his horse, watching, doing nothing. Samuel Hart had been his friend once, before the war made them enemies, before orders turned men into monsters. Before Emmett Crowley chose silence over courage and let a family burn. He set the bridle down, walked back to the house, checked on the girl, still breathing, still unconscious, poured himself a drink he didn't taste and sat in the dark, waiting for something he couldn't name. When the girl finally woke, hours later, the moon was high and the house was silent except for the creak of old wood settling. Emmett heard her stirring, heard the soft gasp of someone waking in a strange place. He moved to the doorway of the spare room, stood in the shadows so she could see him without feeling crowded. She sat up slowly, eyes darting around the room, one hand clutching the blanket like a weapon. "Easy," Emmett said quietly, "you're safe." The girl stared at him, and he watched her decide whether to believe him. It took longer than it should have. "That horse," she said finally, "she's mine." Emmett nodded. "I figured." "Where is she?" "In the barn, fed, watered, resting." The girl's shoulders dropped just slightly. "She came back for me." "Looks like it." Silence stretched between them, heavy with questions Emmett didn't know how to ask. "What's your name?" he said finally. The girl hesitated, then lifted her chin. "Clara." "Clara Hart." Her eyes went wide, then narrow, suspicious. "How do you know that name?" Emmett's throat went tight. "I knew your father." Clara Hart didn't move from the bed. She watched Emmett like he might lunge at her, like trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "My father's dead," she said flatly. Emmett nodded. "I know." "Then how's the bridle on your horse? It has his name stamped on it." Clara's hand went to her throat, fingers finding a thin cord there. She pulled it out from beneath her dress, a tarnished brass button, military issue, hanging from frayed twine. "This was his too," she whispered. Emmett recognized it. 3rd Cavalry, same as the bridle, same as the uniform Samuel Hart had been wearing the last time Emmett saw him alive. 8 years ago. The night Emmett Crowley had sat on his horse at the edge of Samuel Hart's property and watched Confederate soldiers, his own unit, set fire to the barn, the house, everything. Orders were orders, the captain had said. Hart had been marked a Union sympathizer, traitor to the cause. His land would be seized, his family scattered. Emmett had said nothing, done nothing, just sat there watching the flames rise, listening to the screams. He'd told himself it wasn't his place to interfere, that disobeying orders would get him shot, that he had his own family to think about, his own survival to consider. He'd told himself a lot of things that night. None of them had helped him sleep in the 8 years since. "Where's your mother?" Emmett asked, though he already knew the answer, had known it the moment he saw Clara stumble into his barn alone. Clara's jaw tightened. "Dead 2 weeks ago, fever." "Anyone else?" "No." "How'd you get here?" "Walked, rode when Rose had strength for it." She gestured vaguely toward the barn. "We came from Dalton County, took 5 days." Emmett did the math. 50 miles, minimum, through country that didn't forgive children traveling alone. You got family there? He asked. Clara shook her head. We had a room above the livery, but the owner said we had to leave after Mama died, said I was too young to pay rent. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted the blanket into knots. I didn't know where else to go. Mama used to talk about this valley, said my father loved it here, said he had a friend once before the war. She looked up at Emmett, and the weight of that gaze nearly broke him. Was that you? Emmett wanted to lie, wanted to tell her no, that she'd made a mistake, that she needed to leave and find someone, anyone else. But he'd spent 8 years lying to himself. He didn't have it in him to lie to her too. Yeah, he said quietly, that was me. Clara studied him, and Emmett wondered what she saw. A broken-down rancher in his 50s, skin weathered from sun and guilt, hands scarred from work and regret. Mama said you were there, Clara said suddenly, the night they came. Emmett's breath stopped. She said, Clara's voice cracked, but she pushed through. She said there was a man on a horse at the edge of the property. Just sitting there, watching. She saw him when she ran out the back with me. Said she recognized him from before the war, when my father used to bring her here to visit. Emmett couldn't speak, couldn't move. She never said your name, Clara continued, but she said he didn't help, he just watched us burn. The words hung in the air like smoke. Emmett forced himself to look at her, forced himself to see the daughter of the man he'd failed. Your mother was right, he said, and his voice sounded like gravel scraping bone. I was there, I saw it happen, and I did nothing. Clara's eyes filled with something that might have been tears or fury or both. Why? Because I was a coward. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Clara stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. You should have helped. I know. You should have done something. I know. My father would have helped you if it was your family burning. Emmett's throat closed, because she was right. Samuel Hart would have charged into hell itself for a friend, would have stood against his own unit, his own captain, if it meant doing the right thing. And Emmett Crowley had sat on his horse and watched him die. You're right, Emmett said quietly, he would have. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them. She looked impossibly small in the oversized bed, a child carrying weight no one should have to bear. So why'd you let me in? She asked. If you knew who I was, if you knew what you did, why didn't you just turn me away? Emmett looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, still shaking slightly even now. Because I can't undo what I didn't do 8 years ago, he said, but I can make sure you don't walk out of here alone. Clara said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I don't forgive you. I don't expect you to. I don't even know if I can stay here, looking at you, knowing. I understand. But I don't have anywhere else to go. Emmett nodded slowly. Then you'll stay until you do. Clara looked at him again, and this time there was something different in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not trust, but maybe, just maybe, the thinnest thread of something that could become acceptance, given time. Okay, she whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound carried across the valley like a warning. Emmett didn't know it yet, but that warning was already too late. Because 30 miles north, in the town of Redstone, Sheriff Clayton Voss had just received word that Samuel Hart's daughter had been spotted heading south. And Clayton Voss had unfinished business with the Hart family. Business that involved a land deed, a forged signature, and a fire that was supposed to have left no witnesses. He saddled his horse an hour before dawn. 3 days passed. Clara didn't speak much. She ate the meals Emmett prepared, simple things, beans and cornbread, nothing fancy, and spent most of her time in the barn with Rose. The mare seemed to recover faster than the girl, but then again, horses didn't carry the weight of memory the way children did. Emmett gave her space. worked the ranch, mended fence line, checked the cattle grazing in the north pasture, kept his distance, but stayed close enough to hear if she called. She never did. On the fourth morning, he woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, several. Emmett moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. 4 riders coming up the valley road, moving at a steady pace, not hurried, but deliberate, the kind of riding men did when they knew exactly where they were going. He recognized the lead rider before they were halfway to the house. Sheriff Clayton Voss, tall, lean, with a face like chiseled stone and eyes that had never learned mercy. He wore his badge pinned to a leather vest, his gun belt slung low on his hips. The 3 men with him were hired guns. Emmett could tell by the way they sat their horses, by the way their hands rested near their holsters. Emmett's stomach dropped. He moved quickly, quietly, crossed to the spare room where Clara was still asleep, shook her awake gently. "Clara, get up." She jolted awake, eyes wide with panic until she recognized him. "What?" "Men coming, you need to hide." "Who?" "Doesn't matter, just move." He pulled her from the bed, led her to the back of the house. There was a root cellar beneath the kitchen, hidden under a trapdoor covered by a rug. Emmett hadn't used it in years, but the lock still worked. "Get down there, don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Clara's face went pale. "Are they here for me?" Emmett hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." "Why?" "I don't know yet, but I'll find out." He handed her a canteen of water, a blanket. "Stay quiet. I'll come get you when they're gone." Clara grabbed his wrist. "What if you don't come back?" "Then you wait until dark, tack." Rose and ride west. There's a mission in Copper Springs, 2 days ride. Ask for Father Matthews. Tell him I sent you. "Emmett, go." She climbed down into the cellar, and Emmett closed the trapdoor, kicked the rug back into place. He straightened, took a breath, and walked to the front door just as the riders pulled up outside. Sheriff Voss dismounted first. The others stayed on their horses, hands resting casually near their guns. "Emmett Crowley," Voss said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who'd never been told no. "Been a while." "Sheriff," Emmett replied evenly. "What brings you out this way?" "Looking for someone, thought maybe you could help." "Depends on who." Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Little girl, 7, maybe 8 years old, traveling alone. Last seen heading south from Dalton County about 5 days ago." Emmett kept his face neutral. "Lot of empty country between here and Dalton. Girl like that wouldn't make it far." "That's what I thought too, but then I heard about a bay mare that turned up at your place a few days back. Military bridle, looked familiar." Emmett said nothing. Voss took a step closer. "That horse belonged to Samuel Hart. You remember him, don't you, Emmett? Friend of yours before the war, before he turned traitor." "War's been over a long time, Clayton." "Has it?" Voss tilted his head, studying Emmett like a specimen under glass. "Because it seems to me there's still some loose ends that need tying up, like the matter of Hart's land deed. See, after he died, that property was supposed to revert to the county. But there's a claim filed, says he had an heir, a daughter." Emmett's jaw tightened. "What's that got to do with me?" "Well, if the daughter's dead, the claim's invalid. Land goes to auction, and I've got a buyer lined up who's real interested in that valley acreage." Voss's smile widened. "But if she's alive, well, that complicates things." "You rode all the way out here to tell me about a land dispute." "I rode all the way out here because that girl's got no family, no guardian, and no legal right to be wandering the territory alone. She's a ward of the state now, which means she's my responsibility." "That's real civic-minded of you, Clayton." "I'm a servant of the law, Emmett, you know that." The hired guns shifted in their saddles, and Emmett caught the subtle movement of hands drifting toward holsters. "So," Voss continued, "if you've seen this girl, or if she happens to be on your property, the lawful thing to do would be to hand her over. For her own safety, of course." Emmett met his gaze and didn't blink. Haven't seen any children around here, Sheriff, just me and my horses. Voss studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Mind if we take a look around, just to be sure? I mind plenty, but I don't suppose that'll stop you. No, Voss agreed, it won't. So here's the question that changes everything. If you were Emmett, would you stand aside and let them search? Or would you make a line in the dirt and dare them to cross it? Think about that while I tell you what happened next. And if you're still with me, tap subscribe so you don't miss how this turns out. Tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Voss gestured to his men, and two of them dismounted. They moved toward the house, and Emmett stepped into the doorway, blocking their path. I said I mind, Clayton. Voss's expression didn't change. You really want to do this, Emmett, over some girl you claim you haven't even seen? I want you off my property. That's not how this works. Then make it official. Show me a warrant signed by a judge and I'll step aside. Otherwise, you're trespassing. One of the hired guns, a thick-necked man with a scar running down his cheek, laughed. You hear that, Sheriff? He wants paperwork. Voss didn't laugh. He just watched Emmett with those cold, calculating eyes. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. Won't be the first time. Samuel Hart made a mistake too, standing up for things that didn't concern him. Look where that got him. Emmett's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. Voss waited, letting the threat hang in the air. When Emmett still didn't back down, the sheriff sighed and shook his head. All right, Emmett, have it your way. He turned to his men. We're done here for now. The hired guns looked disappointed, but they mounted up without argument. Voss climbed back into his saddle, adjusted his hat. I'll be back, he said, with that warrant, and when I do, if I find out you've been lying to me. He let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. Emmett watched them ride away, standing in the doorway until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he went inside, pulled back the rug, and opened the cellar door. Clara stared up at him from the darkness below, her face pale and frightened. They're gone, Emmett said quietly, for now. Clara climbed out of the cellar slow. Her legs stiff from sitting in the dark. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just stood in the kitchen, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. Emmett poured her a cup of water. She drank it mechanically, like her body remembered what to do even if her mind was somewhere else. Who was that? She asked finally. Sheriff from Redstone, Clayton Voss. What does he want with me? Emmett hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. Your father's land. There's a claim on it, says you're the heir. If you're alive, the land stays in your family. If you're not, he trailed off. Clara's expression didn't change. He wants me dead. I won't let that happen. You don't owe me anything. No, Emmett agreed, but your father did, and I owe him. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then set the cup down. You can't fight a sheriff. I'm not planning to fight him. I'm planning to keep you safe until we figure something out. Like what? I don't know yet. Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. So we're just going to wait here until he comes back with more men and takes me anyway. No, we're going to ride out to Copper Springs tomorrow. Father Matthews has connections with the territorial court. He can help file the claim properly, make it legal. Once that's done, Voss won't be able to touch you. You think a piece of paper will stop him? I think it's better than nothing. Clara turned away, walked to the window. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. It looked peaceful, safe, like the kind of place where bad things didn't happen. But Clara Hart knew better. My father used to say this was the most beautiful place in the world, she said quietly. He'd bring my mother here before I was born, back when he and his friend, she glanced at Emmett. Back when you two would ride together. He said the valley had good soil, good water, that a man could build something here that would last. Emmett said nothing. He wanted to come back after the war, Clara continued. Start over, Raise cattle, maybe horses. Give me a place to grow up that wasn't. She gestured vaguely at herself, at the torn dress and bruised feet. Wasn't this? I'm sorry, Emmett said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. Clara turned to face him. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd helped him that night? Every day. Do you think he'd still be alive? I don't know, maybe, maybe not, but at least I would have tried. And you think trying now makes up for it? Emmett shook his head. No, nothing makes up for it, but it's all I've got. Clara studied him, and Emmett saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something softer, something that looked almost like understanding. I don't hate you, she said quietly. I want to, but I don't. You should. Probably, she looked down at her hands. But my mama used to say hate takes too much energy, that it burns you up from the inside until there's nothing left, and I'm too tired to burn. Emmett felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen for 8 years. Your mother was a wise woman. She was, Clara's voice broke slightly, and now she's gone, and I'm here, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. You're supposed to survive, Emmett said. That's all, just keep breathing, the rest will come. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You really think Father Matthews can help? I do. And you'll take me there. Tomorrow, first light. Clara nodded slowly. Okay. She walked past him toward the spare room, then paused in the doorway. Emmett. Yes. Thank you for not turning me over. You don't have to thank me. I know, but I'm going to anyway. She disappeared into the room, and Emmett stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of her quiet crying through the thin walls. He wanted to go to her, wanted to offer comfort, tell her it would be all right, but he'd lost that privilege 8 years ago, and they both knew it. So he did the only thing he could. He walked out to the barn, saddled Rose, checked her hooves and shoes, made sure she was ready to travel. Then he saddled his own horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Flint, and packed saddlebags with enough supplies for a 2-day ride. He was securing the last strap when Clara appeared in the barn doorway. She'd changed into a spare shirt and pants he'd left in the room, too big for her, but cleaner than the torn dress. Her hair was still tangled, but she tried to comb it with her fingers. Can I help? She asked. Emmett handed her a canteen. Fill this at the pump. We'll need extra water. Clara took it and walked to the pump outside. Emmett watched her work the handle, saw the way her thin arms struggled with the weight of the full canteen. When she brought it back, he took it from her gently and secured it to Rose's saddle. She really does know you, he said quietly. Clara reached up to stroke the mare's nose. My father gave her to my mother the year I was born. Mama used to let me sit in the saddle while she led Rose around the paddock. I'd fall asleep up there, and Mama would have to lift me down. Your father trained her well. He trained everything well. Clara's hand stilled on Rose's neck, except how to stay alive. Emmett didn't have an answer for that. They stood together in the barn, 2 people bound by grief and guilt, and a past neither of them could change. Outside, the sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched across the valley floor. And 30 miles north, Sheriff Clayton Voss was gathering more men. They rode out before dawn. Emmett led Clara behind him on Rose, both horses moving at a steady pace through the gray pre-morning light. The air was cool, almost cold, and their breath misted in front of them like ghosts. They'd been riding for maybe 2 hours when Emmett heard it. Hoofbeats, multiple riders, coming fast from the north. He pulled Flint to a stop, raised his hand. Clara reined Rose in beside him, her eyes wide. How many? She whispered. Emmett listened. 6, maybe more. Voss. Has to be. Clara's knuckles went white on the reins. What do we do? Emmett scanned the landscape. They were in open country, no cover for miles except a stand of cottonwoods near a dry creek bed about a 1/4 mile east. Not enough time to reach it. Stay behind me, he said quietly, and whatever happens, don't run unless I tell you to. Emmett, just trust me. The riders crested the ridge moments later. 7 men, led by Sheriff Voss, the same 3 hired guns from before, plus 3 more, all armed, all watching Clara like she was prey. Voss pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards away. His men fanned out in a loose semicircle, cutting off any escape route. Morning, Emmett, Voss said pleasantly, out for a ride. Just heading to Copper Springs. With the girl you said you hadn't seen. Emmett didn't reply. Voss smiled. You lied to a lawman, Emmett. That's a crime. Could arrest you just for that. You could try. Or you could make this easy. Hand over the girl, go on home, forget this ever happened. Not going to do that, Clayton. Voss sighed. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. He gestured, and 2 of his men started forward. Emmett's hand moved to his holster. Don't, Voss warned. You're outnumbered 7 to 1. Even if you get a couple shots off, we'll cut you down before you clear leather. And then what happens to the girl? Emmett's jaw tightened, but he didn't draw. Voss nodded. Smart, now step aside. No. Emmett. I said no. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward guns. The air went tense, electric with the promise of violence. And then, from behind Voss's men, a voice called out. Clayton! Everyone turned. 4 riders were approaching from the south, old ranch hands, men Emmett recognized from neighboring properties. Grizzled, weathered men who'd worked this land for decades. Men who knew Emmett Crowley, knew his reputation, knew he wouldn't stand in the middle of a valley road unless something was very wrong. The lead rider was Tom Mercer, a cattleman who ran the spread adjacent to Emmett's. He pulled up beside Voss's men, his expression hard. What's going on here, Sheriff? Voss's smile faltered slightly. Official business, Tom, doesn't concern you. 7 armed men surrounding Emmett and a child. That concerns me plenty. The girl's a ward of the state. I'm bringing her in. That's so. Tom looked past Voss to Clara. She looked like she needs bringing into you, or does she look like a scared kid trying to stay alive? One of the other ranch hands, a man named Charlie Bass, urged his horse forward. I know that girl's story, Clayton. Heard about Samuel Hart's daughter. Heard how her mother died and the landlord kicked her out. Heard how she's got a legal claim on Hart's land and how certain folks might not want that claim going through. Voss's expression darkened. You calling me corrupt, Charlie? I'm saying it's mighty suspicious. You riding out here with 7 guns to collect 1 little girl. A 5th rider appeared over the ridge, then a 6th. More ranch hands, more neighbors. Word had spread somehow, maybe through one of Voss's own men who'd had second thoughts, maybe just through the way news traveled in small communities when something felt wrong. By the time they stopped coming, there were 12 men on horseback surrounding Voss's group. Not gunslingers, not soldiers, just ordinary men who decided they'd seen enough cruelty dressed up as law. Tom Mercer looked at Voss, and his voice carried the weight of years spent breaking land and burying friends. Clayton, I worked cattle with you 20 years ago, rode with you before you pinned on that badge, but this, he gestured at the hired guns, at Clara, at Emmett. This isn't law, this is something else. Tom, so here's why. T's going to happen. You're going to turn around and ride back to Redstone. Emmett's going to take that girl to Copper Springs, get her claim filed proper, and we're all going to forget this happened. Voss's hand twitched toward his gun. You threatening an officer of the law. No, I'm telling you how it is. You want to make this a fight, we'll oblige, but I don't think you're going to like how it ends. The hired guns looked at each other, doing quick math. 7 against 12, and the 12 were locals who knew the land, knew each other, and weren't being paid to die. One of them, the thick-necked man with the scar, cleared his throat. Sheriff, maybe we should. Shut up, Voss snapped. But the damage was done. The moment had passed. Whatever authority Voss thought he carried had evaporated in the face of community pushback. Tom Mercer waited, patient as stone. Finally, Voss exhaled slowly and raised his hand. Fall back. The hired guns looked relieved. They turned their horses and started north. Voss lingered a moment longer, staring at Emmett with cold fury. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yeah," Emmett replied, "it is." Voss rode away. The ranch hands stayed until Voss's group disappeared over the ridge. Then Tom Mercer rode up beside Emmett, tipped his hat to Clara. "Mercer." Clara nodded shyly. Tom looked at Emmett. "Heard your barn had a visit a few days back. Bay mare with a military bridle. Figured something was up when Voss started asking questions in town. Appreciate you coming out." "Wasn't just me," word spread. "Folks remember Samuel Hart, remember what happened to his family. Nobody much liked it then, and we like it even less now." He glanced at Clara. "Girl's got a right to her father's land. We'll make sure she gets it." Emmett's throat tightened. "Thank you." Tom nodded and turned his horse. "You two best get moving. Father Matthews'll have the paperwork done by tomorrow if you ask him right." The ranch hands rode away in different directions, back to their properties, their cattle, their lives. Emmett and Clara sat alone in the valley, watching them go. "Why'd they help?" Clara asked quietly. "Because they're good people. But they didn't know me." "No, but they knew your father, and they know what's right." Clara looked down at Rose's mane, her fingers tangling in the coarse hair. "Do you think my father would have liked them?" "I think he would have called them friends. Even after everything. Especially after everything." Clara was quiet for a moment, then she looked up at Emmett. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "If my father were here right now, what would you say to him?" Emmett closed his eyes, and for a moment he let himself imagine it. Samuel Hart, alive, standing in this valley with his daughter safe beside him. "I'd say I'm sorry," he said finally, "and I'd mean it, and I'd know it wouldn't be enough, but I'd say it anyway." Clara nodded slowly. "I think he'd forgive you." "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it for you, I'm saying it because it's true. My mama used to tell me stories about him, about how he believed people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define you forever." She met Emmett's eyes. "I think he'd see what you did today, standing there, ready to die for me. I think that would mean something to him." Emmett couldn't speak. He just nodded, throat too tight for words. They rode on, toward Copper Springs. 2 days later, Father Matthews filed Clara's claim with the territorial court. The paperwork was clean, the lineage clear. Samuel Hart's land belonged to his daughter, legally and irrevocably. Sheriff Clayton Voss made noise for a while, threats, accusations, promises of appeals. But with 12 witnesses willing to testify about his actions on that valley road, and with the church backing Clara's claim, he eventually went quiet. The buyer he'd lined up disappeared. The case closed. Clara stayed with Emmett while the claim processed. She helped around the ranch, learned to mend fence, feed cattle, ride Rose without a lead. She didn't talk about her father much or her mother, but sometimes in the evenings she'd stand at the fence line looking north toward where Hart's land began, and Emmett would see her lips moving in silent conversation with ghosts only she could hear. 3 months later, on a morning when the valley was green with new grass, Clara announced she was ready to see the property. Emmett saddled Flint and Rose, and they rode out together. The land was overgrown, the structures long since burned or collapsed, but the soil was still good. The water still ran clear in the creek. The bones of something worth building were still there, waiting. Clara stood in the middle of what used to be her father's ranch and looked around slowly. "I think I want to build here," she said. "Not now, but someday, when I'm older, I want to make this place what he wanted it to be." "That's a good dream," Emmett said. "Will you help me?" "If you want me to." Clara looked at him. "I do." She held out her hand. Emmett took it. And together they stood in the ruins of the past, looking towards something that might, with time and work and forgiveness, become a future. Years later, people in the valley would talk about the girl who came back to claim her father's land, about the rancher who'd failed once and spent the rest of his life making it right, about the community that chose courage over cruelty. They'd talk about the day 12 men on horseback faced down a corrupt lawman, not because they were heroes, but because they were neighbors. And they'd talk about a bay mare with a military bridle, who'd carried a child 50 miles through hostile country to find the one man who owed her father a debt he could never fully repay. But mostly, they'd remember that sometimes redemption doesn't erase the past. It just plants seeds for something better to grow. And in the end, that's enough. The sun set over the valley, painting the grass in shades of amber and gold. Clara sat on the porch of the new house, modest but solid, and watched Rose graze near the creek. Beside her, Emmett carved her father's name into a wooden marker they'd plant at dawn. Neither spoke, words weren't necessary anymore. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time in 8 years, Emmett Crowley felt something like peace.